Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Stacy.
Yes, Max. Well, in the last episode, we were talking about fashion, and the house that Fiat built is crumbling. The house of fiat money, that is. And you can tell that in what Max finally convinced Jamie Dimon here. Bitcoin price could 10x in the next 5 years, says Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase. Of course, you and I have covered him for years here, even before Bitcoin, about the shenanigans going on at, if you can call it that, shenanigans, we'll say it politely, at JP Morgan. But he was dissing Bitcoin in 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, and now in 2021. As you predicted, he capitulated, and he's saying, hey, Bitcoin's going to 10x in the next 5 years.
Yep. Jamie Dimon was critical of Bitcoin starting when it was at $200 a coin. It's now around $45,000 a coin. It's heading, as he points out, 10x from here. So he's looking for up to 450 to 500,000 a coin. And I've been telling you for years, I had this recurring dream about Jamie Dimon. He would be coming toward me at a deserted mansion in the Hamptons. And for years, he just got closer and closer. And then finally this week, he was in view. He was there on the floor weeping and sobbing and begging forgiveness. And like a good Bitcoiner, I forgive Jamie. And now he's one of us. He's now a Bitcoiner. And welcome. Your daughter was here a lot sooner. She's obviously got her mother's brains. But nevertheless, you're welcome.
I'm showing you, this is Max Keiser, laser eyes at Jamie Dimon. Of course, I said the house that fiat money built is crumbling, and we see that all over the place. We've covered that in the United Kingdom, the gasoline, the petrol prices. All prices are rising across the UK, across Europe, across America, and we're starting to see shortages. A lot of it, the shortages of goods and services are caused by the shortage of workers who don't want to work anymore, but also who haven't been able to be trained because of everything being locked down for nearly 2 years now. We're heading to the second year anyway. One thing I could say about why in this sort of situation we might see Jamie Dimon going towards Bitcoin is that he sees the house of fiat money crumbling, right? And you could see that the Fed speak, how you have Fed speak that's obfuscating all their money printing and the covering up of the crimes. Well, it's starting to make pleb speak. So here's one thing that why Jamie Dimon might want some unconfiscatable wealth is the mood, the mindset. We're always talking about the mindset, the inflationary mindset. Well, part of that is this sort of headline: Berlin votes to target corporate landlords, socialize 250,000 apartments. This was a non-binding vote, but it shows you the mood of the people. About 60% of Berlin voted to basically seize 250,000 apartments from big corporate landlords, those who owned more than 3,000 apartments. They voted non-binding, but that they wanted to seize these properties and socialize them, give them to the people.
Right. As you mentioned, Bitcoin is unconfiscatable. Imagine if Marie Antoinette had Bitcoin. She may have not lost her head. And that's what Jamie Dimon's thinking about right now. But the people in Berlin are facing this huge confiscation of property. Property can be confiscated. Gold can be confiscated. Silver can be confiscated. All the money at your bank can be confiscated. All these things have been, are, and will be confiscated. There's only one asset guaranteed to increase purchasing power over time that's unconfiscatable, and that's Bitcoin. And it's great for people who just want to get some wealth for the first time in their lives, like the folks in El Salvador who are putting away 10, 20 bucks at a time. This is the first time they've had unconfiscatable hard money. Or you're Jamie Dimon and you're trying to, hightail it out of Dodge before the pitchforks and guillotines show up. Either one, you're both welcome to join the Bitcoin revolution.
Right. So, where we saw an exodus of Bitcoin and Bitcoin miners was from China. And now part of it was having to do with them shutting down miners because they said about electricity and electricity costs. Well, here's a headline which does not bode well for the money printers in the West, because part of what we've been doing, and we've been living off of debt, derivatives, piled on top of that debt, piled on top of our fiat currency rails, and more Fed speak, more and more Fed printing. Now the Treasury is printing, the government is printing. Everybody's printing. So everybody's chasing the same number of goods, but the goods are now shrinking in supply too because of energy prices. Suppliers in China for Apple, Tesla, Intel, Nvidia, Qualcomm, NXP, Infineon, ASE forced to halt production amid energy crackdown. The everything shortage keeps promising to keep getting worse. Amid China's many crackdowns is a crackdown on energy consumption, motivated by a slew of reasons, including, most pressingly, spiking prices for coal and natural gas, particularly liquefied natural gas. China is the second largest importer of LNG behind Japan, as Europe and Asia compete for the supply. The supply of LNG for November delivery to Japan and Korea has exploded to $27.45 per million British thermal units on the NYMEX, up from a $6 range a year ago. And here's a chart from the CME group. Here's a year ago, and here is now. And that's part of what's driving what's happening in Europe as well, is because right now European prices for LNG are about $15, $16, and it's probably more by the time this airs. It goes up every hourly. So all the LNG, is going to Asia instead, because they're paying over $27 for their natural gas there. So, Europe had decided to go like on the open market, free market, free competition. And obviously it's a lot more there. Now remember, in the United States, with all the fracking excess natural gas, we were down to like $1 something. So that's showing you how much more they're paying in Asia.
Right. So supply lines are breaking down and costs are going up. Price of energy is going up. This has something to do, let's call it inertia. Right. So inertia, the law of inertia, things that rest at a stop tend to rest at a stop. Things in motion tend to be in motion, continue in motion. And when you come to a dead stop, like we had in COVID, the energy required to get it moving again is exponentially greater than the energy required before just to keep it rolling and ticking over.
Yes.
So you have the benefit for decades now of these major economies able to simply print money to keep the wheels of what was a lot of malinvestment going, even though a lot of these projects, the ghost cities in China or the white elephant projects in the United States, they were papered over with money printing. And then they hit that unmovable object called COVID in 2020. And the belief at the time would be, well, we're going to lock everything down, and then when it's safe, we're going to open things up. And there's kind of in people's minds this idea that the energy required to get it started again won't be particularly greater than the energy was required to keep it going before the stoppage. But that's completely false. The energy required to get these systems going again is exponentially greater than the energy required to keep them going. In many cases, these supply lines are going to have to be rebuilt from scratch. Absolutely. I mean, look at the airline industry to get, or to look at the trucking industry as it relates to energy. It takes 6 months to train somebody to drive one of those trucks. So if you lose all those drivers for various reasons due to money printing, you can't simply turn the switch and get drivers back on. You have a 6-month window that you absolutely have to respect. That's going to cause problems. Just like you can't make 12-year-old scotch in anything less than 12 years. That's one of the facts. That's a truism in the 12-year scotch business. If you have drivers that require 6 months of training before they can drive a gas rig, you can't. That's what it requires. So if you pull the plug on it, now to start it up again, they're finding that they don't have the energy. It's not available at any price. And what's happening to the price? It's going up. And by the way, all the money they printed is still sloshing around, and that's causing inflation. And so systemically speaking, this is the Jim Rickards moment that he spoke about, that snowflake on the mountainside that starts the avalanche. He's a systems analyst, Jim Rickards. He's written many books. Look him up. And I think this is the avalanche.
This could be the avalanche, and it is the house of that fiat money built is crumbling. And it's interesting that if you look at it, the globalized economy built on top of geopolitics. Now, geopolitics is based around mutually assured destruction. That's how it keeps it a consensus model on the politics stage. It is like not of mutual cooperation, but mutual destruction. We will kill each other. On top of this, that geopolitics, you built this economy that we didn't even realize was mutually assured destruction happening, that one piece goes and the whole thing falls apart. I mean, it's kind of tied to what Warren Buffett said about the weapons of mass financial destruction that are, is the spaghetti tying all of this globalized system together. And now we're seeing that because of COVID and the supply chain disruptions and the disruptions to the education system, not only for children and young people, but also for universities and for, the sort of schools and training programs that teach the plumbers, the people who maintain the electric grid, or the people who maintain the supply grid, the logistics grid. If those new people aren't coming online because they haven't been trained for the last year and a half, we're nearing 2 years now, what are you going to do? Some people say, let's go to India, right? Well, India's massive fleet of coal plants are running dangerously low on stockpiles, which may force the nation to buy expensive shipments of the fuel or else risk blackouts. They may have to buy expensive shipments of the fuel. As we just covered, China is also out there trying to find expensive shipments, and Japan. So everybody's racing to get some of these, there's panic buying on the nation state level. And the next panic buying will be of Bitcoin.
Right. Well, the incentives in the traditional economy are not well organized because economics is a social science and not a hard science like physics or chemistry. But Bitcoin is the hard science of money. It is the first time you have algorithmic, mathematically pristine and perfect money. That's the first time in history. And that's why all of this cash sloshing around the system, and there's hundreds of trillions of dollars, it's going to all find its way into Bitcoin. And that's how you get to well over $10 million of Bitcoin. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Rick Ackerman of rickspicks.com. Rick, welcome back.
Always a pleasure, Max. Thanks for inviting me on.
Well, you've got some fascinating things you've been writing about on your blog, but first I wanted to ask you a couple of things about some current events. Evergrande over there in China, the second largest property developer in China, is melting down. The big debate is whether or not this is China's, quote, Lehman moment. What do you think?
Well, maybe. It sort of dropped out of the news. And in my current commentary out the other night, I had a picture of a tsunami. And we know that before the wave actually hits, the tide recedes. And I think we're in that receding tide of a little bit of quietness on the news front. But I think the problem is still very much there.
Well, as I recall, after the 2008 global financial crisis, what financial pundits were saying is that the world will recover because of China's ability to expand their balance sheet and be the buyer of last resort. So they carried the ball for 10 or 12 years, but using the same tricks that were used in America and on Wall Street to create a synthetic environment of activity that was not really real. So basically, did they just make the same mistake all over again?
No, I think, China has become, if anything, more unpredictable because it seems like they're finally doing honest business. They've essentially denied some of their own bubble stocks access to U.S. capital markets. And in the case of Evergrande, there's this appearance of wanting to just let it happen, to let it play out. And the bailout has this one possible feature where essentially all the offshore investors get. And in any case, Evergrande could be about to be deflated to zero. And a lot of people who are holding collateral that relates to Evergrande's portfolio could be in trouble. But China at last seems to be playing honest. They're doing honest business, and it's a real curiosity. But I had a commentary out a couple of weeks ago about how China is going to teach us how to do capitalism the right way.
Right. Well, at around the time of the turn of the previous century, we had something similar in the United States with Teddy Roosevelt, who was called the Trust Buster. And he went after the robber barons, who had become so big that they were influencing government to an extent that folks found unacceptable. So maybe President Xi is the Teddy Roosevelt of the 21st century, Rick.
Could be. He's gone as far as restricting access to the internet to gamers, essentially upgrading his pool of human capital rather than letting them waste away on weekends stuck to their video monitors playing video games. So this is something that would never fly in the U.S. If Biden said, well, we don't want the kids just getting totally immersed in PlayStation, all hell would break loose. But, China just keeps doing the right thing.
Let's go back to what this meltdown of Evergrande might mean globally. We had the contagion in 2008 when Lehman Brothers blew up and Bear Stearns blew up. Is Wall Street exposed to this?
Well, for sure. And we certainly have the experience of 2008 and 9 to assemble the right pieces spin-wise to make people think everything will be all right. But nobody really knows how it's going to play out. They've had quote unquote responsible statements put out there that the exposure of some of the American biggies is not that great compared to their total assets. But you really don't know how the dots connect up. There's such huge leveraging in the system. Virtually any financial asset you could own has been hawked 20 or 30 or 50 times over. So even if it seems like they are keeping Evergrande under control, and even if they succeed, we still know that something much smaller than Evergrande could be the catalyst for a big event.
Right. This brings us to something you've been writing about on your website, and this is what caught our eye here. You ask regarding the Fed's growing reverse repo facility, quote, is this a dry run for the Fed's rapidly approaching, and you invent a phrase here, hypothecated Treasury moment? All righty. So I guess before we talk about the hypothecated Treasury moment, you've got to just do a 30-second recap to the audience about what a reverse repo is.
Well, you have a market that makes it possible. It's the market itself in financial derivatives is expanded through repos and swaps. It's basically a way of, let's say, spreading risk over a wider band of investors, and each one has its own needs as far as what they're looking for in a yield curve. And the market in swaps and repos allows some flexibility in that way. Let me mention that the latest commentary was written by a guest, a fellow named Sean Brown, who's a San Francisco friend of mine from the hedge fund world. And what he's saying, and we've seen this in the markets, the supposedly bluest blue chip collateral you can hold is U.S. Treasuries. But there is a shortage of them, really. And it's one reason why anybody betting that some rampant inflation is going to push bond prices down, yields up, it's not happening because there's really a lot of demand for this collateral. But what this commentary says is that when the collateral is actually needed to get through some crisis, a lot of the holders of that collateral are going to find out that they only own a very small fractional piece of it, and even that they won't be able to get their hands on.
Right. Okay. So to be clear, Sean Brown on your site was making these points, and it's really opening up an interesting line of query. We've been talking about this for quite some time, the problems of rehypothecation. In the United Kingdom, for example, they have infinite rehypothecation. There's no limit to how much you can rehypothecate and lend out a security and then relend it and lend it over again. As you say, some of these securities have been lent out hundreds of times, the same security. So I guess in the United States now, as is so often the case, anything that's happening in any other jurisdiction can be piggybacked by the U.S. and have the same exposure here through the derivatives market, right? Because that's the channel through which all these markets communicate with each other, regardless of jurisdiction. So it's always about whatever jurisdiction has the weakest protections for the investors. That's the jurisdiction that ultimately is running the global market. And right now that jurisdiction would be the United Kingdom. So
well, you mentioned London, and after the collapse of 2007 and 8, a lot of that rehypothecation moved to the London markets, which were less regulated. The U.S. markets, particularly leveraging out of real estate, came under such close scrutiny that London seemed to be the ideal place, especially for hypothecating the supposedly idle balances that sat in a lot of brokerage accounts.
Yeah, exactly. And we also see this evident in what's called mark to model instead of mark to market. So at the end of the day, brokers, they're supposed to kind of give a glimpse of what their books are and where the assets are, where the liabilities are, but they don't actually use straight up accounting. They use a model. They'll say, well, these securities are worth X, Y, and Z depending on a model that we have, not the actual valuation in terms of what somebody might buy for this stuff. So this hyper-hypothecated treasury analysis or theory by Sean Brown. So it's not enough to say that these markets have zero collateral. What we're saying is that the markets have almost an infinite negative collateral. If that even, can you get into that if that makes sense?
Well, every time you use the word model, it's kind of, you're using it tongue in cheek. We all do, because we know these models really are designed by crackpots with no real understanding of the markets. And whatever, however many sigmas they want to send the tails out, there's always that that immense tail risk that no one's calculated, even in some of these stress tests that they do with the banks. So, and it's also possible to say nobody really understands these markets. Everybody has, let's say, a niche understanding of some feature of it. Let's say you could have an expert at Citibank who knows how to take Bolivian reverse floaters and turn them into, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of negotiable instruments. Digital instruments, but even that person doesn't really know how all the things connect up. And again, as I mentioned earlier, and as we all know, the systemic risk is there relative to some very small things that could happen. We're kind of looking at Evergrande, but the system is so intrinsically unstable, pulled by forces, not the least of which is the Fed mandate to inflate or die, that nobody knows really how it's going to settle out or what could be the trigger event.
All right. So we know that derivatives are printed in the hundreds of trillions. The total derivative markets are in the multi-quadrillion. And I look at something like U.S. tax receipts collected by the IRS last year, approximately $3.5 trillion. That's literally not even 10 minutes worth of derivatives trading in the globe. So why do people... Why do people pay taxes? You can simply, you can spend 3 minutes, press a button, and cover that cash. Why do people pay taxes?
I've asked myself the same question. If they really wanted to stimulate, why not just have a tax moratorium for the year 2022 or 23? Because the sums that are involved, the actual taxes collected, are much, much less than is being played with in a kind of digital hypothetical way in the big picture. So I guess the reason for that is because the taxes pay for real things. For one, Medicare and Social Security, everybody gets their checks. And I've always used that as an example of why when a big one hits, the Fed will not be able to reinflate the system because so much of it will be imploding systems where real checks go out to millions and millions of, let's say, state pension recipients and people like that. That takes real money, and that's why we still have taxes.
Right, and the answer too is that bankers get paid on gross, not making profits. Gross quantity of debts and derivatives created. It's like the Hollywood model. You get paid on the size of the budget. You don't get paid on whether the movie makes money or not. That's
Just
why,
so.
right? Budgets are huge. So if you're a bank and you can create a half a quadrillion in derivatives, you get a percentage of that half a quadrillion. It doesn't make any sense if they make money or if they're even economically viable, but that's how you get paid. So the incentivize to just create more of them, right, Rick?
Right. And something similar has happened in the markets themselves. You know, the people who regulate them, I guess, see the realm that they regulate as their, let's call it a fiefdom. And the larger it is, the more trading volume you have, the more responsibility they can impute to themselves.
All right,
you've
Rick,
had
this is
you've
fascinating.
had-
We're going to have to carry it over to a part 2. Thanks for being on Keiser Report.
Thank you very much for inviting me on, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, Rick Ackerman of Rick's Picks. Until next time, bye, y'all.